So I'm Sebastián Calderón Bentin, and I teach in the drama department here at Tisch.
And I'm Cathy Naden, and I'm a founder member of Force Entertainment from Sheffield in the UK.
Well, first I want to say on behalf of all of us that we're very happy to have you and the group here and sharing the work. And I was at an event with Tim where he talked a little bit about some of the work in the English department. This was, I think, the day before on the Thousandth.
Uh-huh.
And so that was great. So it's also great to have more time to talk. I first encountered your work with Quizula in 2003. And I was doing a semester abroad in Rada. And it was a time where there was this big exhibit at the Tate. I don't know if it was Adrian Heathfield who was curating it.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think the piece was in the Tate. Guillermo Gomez Peña was there as well. And I didn't even know about Forced Entertainment. I was just so enthralled by this question session. And it was only later that I put together the name with that piece. It was years later that I came to know the work of the company. And then I had seen also in Chicago some years ago the Notebook at the MCA, which I know you were presenting work there as well.
Yeah.
And then now the Thousandth, and then Tabletop Shakespeare, which I saw the Pericles as well. So anyway, for me it's a huge honor to be able to meet you and talk about the work. And I mean, maybe we should pick up on what we were talking in the hallway, which was about Pericles, and because it's, I mean, for me it was a play I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And so it was also interesting to get to know a play through its plot structure. So maybe if you can we can start with that, with the experience of working with that play in particular, and as opposed to, I'm sure, more like Macbeth, you know.
Yeah.
It's nice that there's a completeness of all the works in Tabletop Shakespeare.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think when just to sort of talk a bit generally about some of the things you said there. When people come and see the complete works, often they'll come and see the ones they know. They're sort of drawn to the ones that are familiar. So we try and persuade them to come and see the ones they don't know. So that we say, sort of maybe come and see a couple, see one you know, and then see one you don't know. So Pericles is definitely down the end of the plays that people don't know very well. Because I think when you don't know the story, you really see the kind of schematics of the plot, and you really get the sense of it as a storytelling project. Because with complete works, it's really true that it's not about us doing our versions of the Shakespeare play. It's really about this sort of what happens between the performer, who's kind of part storyteller, part like puppeteer, arranging the objects around on the table. And the sort of this text that each performer has prepared that is in a way a response to the plays that they've read. So it's not about using the Shakespearean language, or it's just about sort of retelling the story. So I think with Pericles, the thing that struck me about it was that it was just this sort of this yarn, as we were saying, this sort of a tale that in a way just goes on and on. It doesn't. It's not, say, like the Shakespeare comedies and the ones that people might know very well, like Twelfth Night or A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's a real shape and pattern to those comedies where it's because it's often about mistaken identities, and then the people are revealed to be who they really are. And everything, sort of everything is disordered, and then it kind of gets put back into an order. But Pericles just sort of rambles on and on and on. And then I think the thing that struck me about it was, one, it had this character called Gower in it, who's like a stage, a chorus, I guess. And there is this sort of interesting thing about Shakespeare, which we weren't really expecting to discover, that all those centuries ago that he was making theatre, there are little correspondences, if you like, between the way that we make theatre now, that this sort of talking directly to the audience, and this sort of deconstruction of the fiction, I suppose. So this Gower character's a bit like that. He's sort of speaking directly to the audience about events. So that was sort of something that I was very interested in. And then this sort of like the endless storms and shipwrecks, so sort of being able to make something of that repetition in a way. You know, repetition is always something that's kind of interested us in making. I think because it's really quite fairy tale like. So there's sort of these very stock kind of good characters and evil characters. And in terms of casting, then it was just sort of fun to be quite literal about that, and to do sort of all the evil characters as objects that are sort of very dark or black. This sort of sense of it being a dark and sinister sort of place. And then the sort of good characters are kind of white or sort of silver-coloured objects. And the first scene in Pericles is sort of where Pericles has this sort of riddle that he has to solve, and if he solves it, he kind of wins the beautiful princess in marriage, and if he fails the challenge, then it's death. And so there's sort of just two characters in that scene, but it was really nice using all the different objects, almost like scenery. So that there's like an umbrella and a little can of sort of car oil, and a little plastic black sort of flower pot. So the kind of just playing a game that's about sort of colour coded and different heights of objects. So you're kind of making a little scene really. So that was a kind of guiding principle in Pericles, I think, was to sort of really simplify the plot and play with these repeating features like the shipwreck, and then to sort of make these, because it's a lot of travelling in it, make the different countries that he's travelling to have these sort of features, like all the characters here are sort of silver objects, and all the characters here are sort of white or beigey coloured.
With the threads also, the king and queen, she's the yarn.
Oh, she's like a ball of wool.
Yes, and he's a
scrubbing brush. Yeah, but they're the same. That it's like a beige colour, and he's kind of, it's like white bristles, and then the sort of a beigey coloured plastic. Yeah.
I think there's something, because you're right, there is always this move in Pericles where they all end up at the harbour.
Yeah.
And he's always leaving.
Yeah.
And I think if one were to experience the play as a full production, one would get that that's a scene that is happening. But I think by having this abridgment of the plot, you get that repetition in a much more starker way.
Yeah.
So I think the way you were playing with the choreography of that already kind of, we're listening to a story, but it made it very clear we're seeing a structure at the same time.
Yes.
And I thought that worked. It was both a plot and a comment on plot itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that sort of in that sense, we've all rewritten some of our plays here and there to do that sort of job to them, to make the structure kind of more apparent. So we've taken some liberties ourselves as storytellers, because it's sort of about making it also fit into what we as performers doing it now here in the 21st century can make work for a contemporary audience as well. So
that makes sense in a way, that there's a kind of a particular take on the plot.
Yes. Yeah, and I think we all have slightly different attitudes to what we're doing with it. Like some people, and I think it depends on what play you've got as well, but some people stick more to the poetry, and there's a little bit of paraphrasing, but like in Pericles with the whole harbour scene, I just kind of invented, because it's about sort of playing spatially with the table, like you can take them to the edge of the table, and it's like, because it's a bare stage in a way, and you can make it look like they've come to the edge of the country, there's the sea out there sort of thing. So it's that's the sort of game that we play with quite often. Is if it's not, the characters go to the edge of the table and they're looking out of the window, or they're looking down at something, or playing with sort of spatial arrangements. So all the characters are kind of across the table this way, and that way, if there's a sort of dance scene, so that they can sort of be facing each other, and then they all go that way. But it's very simplified, it's diagrammatics.
Right, exactly. You have that also in the scene where they're doing a kind of tournament, and the nights go by. These choreographic moments. And what I find it interesting, I found myself, and also with the audience, how quickly, as soon as a story is framed around an object, even though it's not really functioning at the level of puppetry, in the sense of, they're almost like placeholders.
Yes.
With mobility, but mostly placeholders. Yeah. At times there would be a gesture, like the servant who looks, but I was surprised how we quickly endow an emotional connection and a kind of sentience.
Yeah.
Because then you realize when a character dies, there is a people, and they're really feeling for this object.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder about that experience, how you feel people start kind of projecting into the object quite quickly.
No, that really does happen, and I think when we were sort of first rehearsing it as a kind of concept or as a thing, that was the aspect of it that really struck us, that you could put a sort of jar of tomato ketchup in the middle of the table, say for Macbeth, and say, Macbeth is thinking about what he's just done, and then you just stop talking and let the attention be on the object, and you really start to fill in the gaps. As an audience, you're looking at it, what is that thinking? So you do really breathe life into these kind of inanimate objects, and I think that's sort of, it's part of a strand of work that we do that's really about sort of letting the imagination work in the audience, and giving the audience space for their imagination to bring its own sort of picture-making ability to what's happening, or this idea of filling in the gaps. So what you were saying about Pericles going up to the harbour, there's no set there to suggest that, but the audience sort of fills in that picture. And I think it's the same with giving these characters sort of like the humanising them, like these empty objects can require these very sort of human emotions, or even sort of really big dramatic sort of emotions.
So there's, in a way, there a pause, and I noticed a pause also when, for example, someone sings a song, and I don't know if it's which of the characters, you must know who sings the song.
Yeah.
It's a woman, and you say, no, now she sings a song, and there's a pause there.
Oh, yeah.
And it's again leaving the audience a time to imagine the song, or if you don't imagine, just to wait for the song to happen.
Yes.
And it's like, very, very, there's an intention there to always give the audience that space for them to enter.
Exactly. Yeah. And I suppose it's allowing, in that, say with the song, sort of that, it's playing with time a bit, isn't it?
Yes.
Sort of allowing the elapse of time. So a few moments later, that's. But it just for those moments that nothing is happening, it does make the space feel different for an audience. So
yes, absolutely.
that, I think that's something that we sort of play with a lot, is how to use time on stage and make an audience enter time differently, so that, like, from moment to moment you can suddenly change the way that time is operating.
And Tim had mentioned how there is a kind of weight on British companies that are well established, and they would say, when are you going to do Shakespeare? And your company's had a body of work for many years, and this is a first piece where you engage with Shakespeare, and it's such a heavy canon. How has the experience been now that you've toured the piece, and of that part that is recognition and the canon, but also part in the way you're stretching it, and in a way also is a bit of a send-up also of the canon as well.
Yeah. And I think that's why we wanted to call it the complete works. And I think we liked the idea where people would say to us, sort of, why don't you do a Shakespeare play? That why would we do Shakespeare, for God's sake? But then when we did come to do it, we would do the whole lot,
right,
all of it.
Right.
And I think the way that we're tackling it is really important. That it is this sort of because I think the whole project, each of the plays speaks to the bigger project, which is this sort of marathon of all of them, that we've divided each play down to a kind of 45-minute, in some cases an hour long sort of sentence, if you like, in the big sentence that is the kind of canon of Shakespeare. But the fact that everything is performed by these little objects, and that the objects are there on display, so there's shelves around the table in the middle where each play gets performed. It's like the objects as characters are always looking at the empty stage in the middle. So whenever an audience comes and sees any individual play, they're always aware that they're seeing this one, but they could be seeing that one or that one, or that they might have just missed that one and now they're seeing this one. So it's about making the parts no more important than the whole, I think. But I think in terms of taking on Shakespeare, I think people do come with expectations in a way that they might not with other forced entertainment shows. That sort of they might be getting a version of a Shakespeare play rather than quite grasping the whole concept in the first place. That it's all of the plays together, and each it's a unit, each made up of different all the different units of the play. So so then you're kind of dealing with all of that baggage that Shakespeare comes with about sort of it's an interpretation. It's this you're playing a character in a particular way. So it's stuff to do with kind of characters and sort of psychological sort of playing of the events. But I think because we try and make it clear that it's not the poetry, and it's not a version of Shakespeare, that it's everyday language with everyday household objects, that people realise quite quickly that they're not coming to see, like the Royal Shakespeare. We're imitating the Royal Shakespeare in doing our Shakespeare, that it is quite a different take on that text. I mean, it's really like dealing with it as a text and a job of storytelling, I think.
And for because I immediately think also that I when I saw Henry the Fourth, I didn't notice so much the almost like storage closet that was all of the other plays. And I think it was because where I was seated, and I arrived just shortly before it started. But in your piece in Pericles, which I had more time to look around, it does almost feel like to think of canons or literary canons or dramatic canons as this kind of storage closets and kitchens that one goes. That is not necessarily a place of reverence. It's not a museum. They're there, and it feels they can be almost domestic in a way, in the way that family stories are passed on or told. So I feel there was something also about the piece that spoke to what canons are, and how they can be treated as material, not bashed, but also not recanonized, but just as a kind of material that have the structure to them, And as you say, this question with canons of wholeness, and then what does it mean to then partition or to rearrange,
I suppose I don't know if it's demystifying, but it's sort of decanonizing the canon, I suppose, because I think it is very domesticated, this sense that it's sort of just storage, and that the things on the shelves are really what you would find, in your kitchen cupboard or your bathroom cupboard. And that's really how we started out making it. We had a sort of table in the rehearsal room, and we put up some shelves, and people were just bringing in, sort of stuff from the kitchen cupboards that they were like little spice jars that they never bothered using. So the sense also that objects were old, that they were just a bit stained or greasy or dusty from being in the cupboard. But we also went to the supermarkets and brought up stuff because it was we liked the look of it, or the nice packaging and all that kind of thing. So we added that to the stuff on the shelves, and then people were bringing in like sort of like little items that had some sort of personal meaning. Because at the time when we started making it, I was kind of clearing out my mum's flat. So I was bringing in in Antony and Cleopatra, all the handmaidens and these little cotton reels. So I was bringing in like all of that stuff. So there's sort of like personal items plus, kind of branded stuff plus sort of every now and again you go around the second-hand shops and you sort of see, I don't know, like a jug or something, think, that's a perfect full staff, and bring that in. But it's, but this sense that nothing is sort of extraordinary, I suppose. They're just, and it's seeing them all on mass together, isn't it? It's this sort of celebration of the domestic in a way.
Yes, absolutely. And the idea of the found object as opposed to the designed puppet or designed object. Because some are, for example, some had brands that brands are also context specific. So a brand known in England might not be known here, or some are brands that are having now expired. So all of the kind of detail of the object also starts coming into contact with whatever character we're projecting on it at the same time.
Yeah, definitely.
Making when you mentioned the space given to the audience to after the character says something, give them a time to kind of process or think about the object or the song, is I saw a similar operation in on the Thousandth Night with these stories that don't end and that kind of space, because one reaction was, why am I not getting the resolution? But of course, then is the joy that one can create one's own resolution of the story, and also that another story is about to start. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the process of how that performance, the concept behind that performance, how it came about.
The sort of storytelling game, which is this basically that somebody has to start a story and it's once upon a time, so it has this kind of fairy tale like beginning each one, and then you have to keep going until somebody else says stop, and then the person that said stop then has to start their own story. I think at the time we were sort of looking for things that were really clearly games like that, and that storytelling game was originally part of a 24-hour piece. It was just one sort of returning section. So we started out making durational pieces probably in the mid-90s. So Quizula was kind of the first text-based sort of game that's got a very clear game in it. And then we made sort of various other durational pieces. And I think we just wanted to push at making them last longer. So like, okay, if we've done 6 hours, why not do 24? So we did it at the South Bank in London. And there were all sorts of costuming games that we were exploring at that time. So a lot of the show was about very simple little acts, and we had lots and lots of animal costumes. There were sort of the kinds of costumes you get in fancy dress shops. Like a pantomime cow or a pantomime horse or a sort of teddy bear or a mouse or a lion, these kinds of things. So there was a long game about just putting on the animal costume and then sort of we had a little stage on top of the big stage, and sort of these creatures would stand on the stage and somebody would write alive on a blackboard, and then the creature would die, and then the person on the blackboard would rub out alive and write dead, and then the creature would sort of come back to life, and then they'd write alive again. So these very simple sort of games come magic acts was a big interest of ours at that time. This sort of, I suppose it's if the kind of theatre we make is not sort of narrative theatre, then we have to look for other kinds of sort of excuses for being on stage, and quite often we've mined the territory of sort of stand-up or magic acts, and this can quite often really crap magic acts, these things that are very sort of basic and a bit hopeless. So this 24-hour piece was full of stuff like that, but every now and again there were maybe, I think the first time we did it, there were about 18 performers on stage. So it was the forced entertainment company plus guest performers.
Okay.
So at sort of certain points over the 24-hour period, we probably did it about 8 times over the whole 24-hour period. We would form these lines with chairs and do this storytelling game exactly like it was in the King's. But we quite often have different costumes on. So sometimes we were dressed as these animals, but without the animal heads on. And the whole red cloaks and cardboard crowns was one of the costumes that we were playing within that show. And I think we got asked to do a festival in Beirut 2001, and we just thought, that storytelling game is a sort of a piece in its own right. So we kind of picked the king and queen costumes, and then we just played around with that storytelling game, seeing how far we could kind of push it. And that's really something we do quite a lot, is sort of recycle ideas. So you might make a show that's sort of a bit messy and chaotic, but is quite rich, and that you can sort of pull things out of it for years afterwards, and sort of say, that's the show, and that's the show. So it doesn't occur to you at the time, but you come, you revisit them, and you can sort of pull material out and make something kind of quite is related, but it's also quite new and a new thing in its own right. So we wanted to, in a way, push at the game. I think when we first started doing the Kings, it was perhaps less that we were less interested in the content of the stories and much more interested in the game of it. So we went down to 8 people. So we usually it's us usually plus two other people. It was 7 when we did it here. But yeah, originally we sort of, I think it was about really playing with those dynamics between performers on stage and different energies, and playing with the energies of what you're like when you start and you're quite fresh, and what you're like after 4 hours, where it's sort of the effort of having to keep it up is really making people tired, and things get very slow, and then they also start to get very silly and people get a bit hysterical. So this gives really nice energy, and also that all of the acting goes out of it as well. You stop thinking about that you're on stage, and you stop trying to sort of censor your own material or your own sort of behaviour on stage in a way. So that does very interesting things. So a lot of the dynamics we were playing with were sort of like what happens when you have everybody in the line all playing, all competing. So you have the stops coming in very quickly. So you might have once upon a time there was a king, stop, once upon a time there was a queen, stop, once upon a time there were 3 kings, stop, once upon a time there were 2 queens. And you get this very sort of competitive, very high turnover of sort of beginnings of stories being carved up. But it creates this very sort of choppy energy, out of which something quite different can suddenly emerge. Because you sort of, as you're doing these games, you sort of you start to write the rules for them. So you sort of say, after 5 minutes of very choppy stuff, somebody has to then come in with a bit of content. So it goes back to this idea of structure again, how you structure this kind of work. So again, it's also if you've got a line, all people in play, that's a different thing to suddenly going down to 2. And if you've got 2 people sitting next to each other in a line, that what they're doing might be quite supportive and in agreement, or maybe if one's at one end and one's at the other, perhaps they're really competing with each other, or perhaps they are sort of building a more sensitive story that's sort of travelling this sense of distance between them. They're trying to connect over that distance. So it's those sorts of dynamics that are to do with the kind of architecture of time and the bodies in space and how many people are in play. So all of that's happening without having to think so much about the content of what stories actually are. And we've now performed that show many times, and it's interesting because it starts to tip in the other direction. So in these days we're more interested in the content of the stories and less, I don't know whether it's because we've got older, we can't be as sort of, perhaps we're not as energetic with it anymore. Or I think when you do shows for quite a long time, you're looking back at the younger versions of yourselves doing them, and what really made sense at that time sort of stops making sense after a while. You sort of think you get interested in something else. So we were talking a lot the last few times we've done it about actually sort of how the stories are kind of quite often coming out of, I suppose, a white middle class sort of left-wing perspective. We're sort of jokey about that, but what does it mean to sort of push content or stories that come from really somewhere other? So we've been talking about that quite a lot. But people always have like a little collection of stories that they can draw on as well. So some of those stories that have been around for a very long time. So people have a kind of pool of stories that don't always make it into the shows each time. But because I think because the other thing is that you can be left on your own. So nobody can stop you. So this is the sense of you leave somebody out to dry. What happens to them and how do they start to invent? So people, I think, prepare stories for those moments in case you get left alone. So you've got something to say. But these are very interesting moments where because something real is happening, and that's again is something that we're always looking for when something can be very sort of silly and playful, but then it sort of becomes real because the situation has changed for the performer, and they're dealing with a more sort of difficult relationship to the audience or something, because now they've got to perhaps deliver, and the pressure's on. So the audience is watching somebody struggle, and they kind of feel for them in that struggle. Are they going to come up with something, or are they just going to be speaking nonsense?
And they're left physically alone as well.
Yeah.
So it's a temporal and also a spatial kind of condition that they're left in. We were talking in class also about how it felt at times almost like a jazz group, and storytelling became a way to kind of improvise or provide a kind of counterpoint to each other and improvise with storytelling, but in a way that had that the music was obviously the content is there, but the music was more on the structure of the interruption and the variations on theme. At times I noticed we would go into kind of Shakespeare fairy tale narratives, and then it would move into domestic love stories, and then into horror, and then into science fiction and astronauts, and then back to a fairy tale. But there were some themes that would emerge, and that someone would subvert it. But still, there was a kind of group moves, I imagine by virtue of sharing the space and the way you improvise, you're picking up energies just at the same time as you're trying to do your own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even when the very original versions of it, the kind of the sort of basic rules that we set up was this that everything would start with once upon a time. So this is when it was part of the 24-hour piece. Because we sort of liked the idea that you could give it very clearly says it's a story, and it gives it that it's as if it's a fairy tale, but it could be anything. So you could work with real stories, sort of fairy tales or Shakespeare's or plots from novels or plots from films, or you could turn a news story into a story. So some kind of the story about the football team that was trapped in the cave. Did you hear that one? That there was a sort of big news.
Right in was it?
Yes,
in Thailand.
In Thailand,
yes,
exactly.
Yes.
So that came up at one point. But you can turn something that's quite a sort of unpleasant situation into a fairy tale by giving it this kind of once upon a time.
I see.
Sort of
this kind of pastiche moves.
So yeah, it could be historical events, things, sort of current events, whatever. But you turn it into this story by starting with Once Upon a Time, and the only sort of rule was that you could never say real names or place names, because that sort of collapsed the game somewhat. Because there is a sort of a pleasure in, at some point, the story becoming recognisable. So on Saturday there were quite a few sci-fi things. They went through several film plots, didn't it? Of astronaut films. So there's a kind of pleasure, I think, for the people playing. Like, can my colleagues guess which story I'm doing? But also for the audience. But so that that's one sort of thing that you get from not saying any names. But also, I think if you stop listening in the same way, if it's like once upon a time there was an awful president called Donald Trump.
Right.
It's the fact that you have to be more sort of inventive about the thing it is that you're sort of trying to describe, and that it becomes a kind of task of language in a way. So there's something else going on in that. It's not just simply telling stories. There's a kind of work that the brain has to do.
That's interesting, because what you're saying is almost a kind of restraint.
Yeah.
The restraint allows a kind of copiousness of the story.
Exactly. Yeah. And we talked a lot about building stacks. So there is a kind of agreement on a theme. So now all the stories are about sort of couples who are in love. And you keep building that stack until the stack gets so high it kind of topples over, So these are just what we call sort of performance strategies.
And the order of those themes is predetermined, or not necessarily?
No, I mean, I think there's a sort of certain amount of knowingness because we have performed it so much. So we sort of, and because as a group of 8 people doing the job of the storytelling, you have to kind of listen to what's going on, so you get a sense of where something's going very quickly. You're sort of like, right, okay, so we're now going to do sort of film plots about sort of heist movies or something.
Right.
It's about robbers. So, and then it's I think your analogy about music is really true. That's because it is really like how musicians improvise. It's sort of like you're just feeling around for the notes, and then suddenly it comes, and something emerges, and you're all singing, from the same song sheet or playing the same tune at that moment, and then somebody goes off and takes it in a different direction. So it's really creating live in front of the audience its own sort of dramaturgy, its own structures, and I think for what makes it very watchable for an audience is you never quite know when the next little sort of number comes from. You're watching people try and find something, and then when and that you're sort of almost outside of time when that's happening. We're in that sort of relationship to the performance, like sort of it's not quite working, is it? What's going to happen next? And then suddenly it takes off. And then you it's like that mind, that part of your brain that's kind of monitoring it stops. You're just in the moment with the performers, enjoying the invention. And there was a lot of riffing on Saturday night. That the kind of wordplay, a lot of punning. Yeah.
Yes, with the fairly successful small mid-size, dentist office. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's also sometimes it's kind of word association. Sometimes it can be really sharp and smart, and sometimes it's just it's almost like you can't stop yourself from saying the most stupid thing. Because the association is so obvious.
Right.
You're just saying something kind of stupid, really.
But that's interesting what you mentioned earlier, that, you say, well, at the end, these stories are coming from a kind of middle class or white or English background. And it's interesting because, in a way, because the piece opened things up for this group of performers to dive into their imaginary archives and pull things out, it does become a kind of ethnography of whoever is on stage.
Yes.
Whatever, your own cultural, your own socialization, your own history will be coming up in those tales, in those stories.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to think of it also as a kind of ethnography of imagination.
Exactly.
That tells us also something about this group of people.
Yeah.
You know, I can imagine a different cast, from a different country would, but with the same constraints.
Yeah.
So that's quite, there's a kind of sociological imagination even within it.
Yeah. And it's, it just reminded me that, one of the things we used to say about it was that it should, when it was part of the 24-hour show, was it should have this sense of, it was keeping a vigil, because it comes from originally the Arabian Nights, Thousandth Nights tales, and where Scheherazade tells tales to keep herself alive, and they never sort of finish. One tale becomes another. So this sense that you're sort of keeping vigil it's the long night that you're kind of seeing through, and that stories could have a slightly sort of scary or dangerous element to them as well. But I think after we did it at this festival in Beirut, and it was at the time when they were sort of having local elections, and it was quite an unstable time.
And when you did it in that production, was it 6 hours or 12?
6.
It was 6.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that one we've only ever done for 6.
For 6.
I don't think we've done it longer than 6. But somebody had come to see it, and then I think they got arrested sort of sometime after the performance and they ended up teaching the game to the people that they were held in the cell with.
Wow.
So they were just that this thing about it being a marker of ethnography. I would have loved to have seen the stories that they came out with. And when I do workshops occasionally, I sort of get students to play that game, and it's a very different thing because of course they're coming out with their stories.
With their stories, exactly. In that way, it becomes more of creating a situation rather than kind of narrating a plot in this sense.
Yeah.
I was also thinking that the show has this almost like wonderful example of allegory, where it's basically a metaphor in narrative, because at times you could see that you, the performers, were speaking to each other through the stories.
Yes.
It was not about the content. I mean, the content of the stories was merely a kind of a use of allegory to really say, please shut up, or can we change the story, or when he said, well, there was once a king who banned the words fairly, and so it was this amazing way to see also allegory work in a quite literal way, between the performers.
Yeah. It's a way of sort of getting at your fellow performers on stage as well, it's like saying shut up, but you have to do it through the story.
And with the audience kind of in there watching.
They're sort of witnessing the kind of like, so one person perhaps being told is like transgressive, isn't it? One person is being told off by the others for you're being too silly now, or or you lighten up.
right, exactly. It's getting a little too
So
I thought that was really beautiful, and yes, and I guess one thing maybe to finish up is how was this particular performance here? You've already mentioned some things that came up, but how did you feel? I know I saw some people in the audience with pajamas.
Yeah.
I know some people stayed till the end.
Yeah,
people came and went. How was the experience for you?
It was really good. It felt like they were really up for it, in the sense that sort of, I think maybe because it started at midnight, because normally it would be like 6 in the evening till midnight, so it would finish at midnight rather than starting at midnight. So I think there's a sense that people come knowing that it's going to be a bit of a night, It has a sense of event about it. So so people might bring their pajamas in case they want to kind of have a little nap or something. So that was a really nice sort of aspect to it. Sort of, I think at the beginning where the auditorium seemed to be kind of flooded with all the people coming in, and then gradually there's sort of people do leave, So you get the kind of die-hard audience left at the end, but it's also quite difficult to tell whether people have just disappeared behind the seats to go for a sleep and just not sort of woken up again,
like an airport terminal or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, or whether they've gone home. And they were really up for it in the sense that they were laughing a lot. So I think there's a sense when you get this kind of an audience that feels very present in that way, that you want to really sort of entertain them, I guess. So that can influence a little bit the direction that the kind of the structures and the content goes in. Sometimes you're sort of looking to sort of play things down the funny end for a while. So but it felt kind of quite light and playful for that, which was actually felt really nice. When we first did it at the South Bank in London as part of this 24-hour piece, people were kind of leaving because they were tired and wanted to go home. But we heard stories about people who would sort of get on the bus and then sort of nearly get home and decide that they had to go back because the performance was still going on. They didn't want to miss it, really, so they would then sort of come back to the theatre. So I think it's that eventness about it that's really pleasurable, I think. So I think that sense that it was happening between midnight and 6 in the morning, that you really feel like everyone is in the same room, and that the kind of line between us and the people watching on Saturday night sort of gets more and more blurry, because we all become in the same state, we're all equally sort of tired, and that people watching are investing their sort of time and energy in it for a long period of time.
I remember leaving for maybe 20 minutes and then coming back, and I thought, I'll leave for maybe an hour, take a nap and come back. But as soon as I got home, I realized I'm missing it. And then I told myself, well, there's nothing to miss. The stories are just being interrupted. But for some reason, it still created this sense of I'm missing even the interruptions, almost as if there is an arc, even for yourself as spectator. And the piece has this weird pull where even though nothing will be resolved, that you still feel when you leave that even if you leave to come back, that you're missing something important. And I thought that was an interesting reaction in relation to the dramaturgy of the piece, that it creates that effect of drawing you in to the game, to the situation.
Well, it's sort of creating this sense of resolution or importance where it doesn't, where there is none, isn't it? Out of sort of nothing, out of these endless interruptions that there is this sort of creation of that something is really happening at the same time. And it might be that you hope that perhaps a story goes on much longer, that you almost or you get some. I think it's the same when we do it, that somebody might one day just tell the best story ever, which has never happened. But but there's also that sense that it's sort of failing in its own game all the time. Because it's at the limits of what our imaginations can achieve, really, isn't it? And I think it plays also with this, as is it better to be telling stories collectively? Can we get somewhere more interesting by throwing in multiple perspectives on something, or when it comes down to maybe one person, can one person sort of deliver something more meaningful? And the answer to either of those is no, not really, but somehow it's I think it's setting up this pull that you're talking about. It's a pull towards something that could be. I suppose it's towards potential or possibility, isn't it?
Yes, and it also, I think the other thing that one starts missing is that, and some of my students mentioned this. Inside jokes start to develop with the audience.
Yes.
And so know that if you leave, you might be missing later references
yes.
to things that happened.
That's
you
very
know,
true.
and that creates a kind of melancholy of knowing, you know, you won't be able to get that, you know.
Yeah, it's a little bit akin to that sort of, you know, I saw that band when they were small, you know.
Yes.
Like I was in, you know, part of the in crowd of that, you know, or something. I don't know if it's like that or not. But no, I think it's, there's a kind of camaraderie that's built up with the audience. And the people who come in later, what are they laughing at? You know, they're not sort of part of that
Right, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
It's just a clever strategy to make sure people stay there longer.
And to amuse each other also, you know, as time, yes.
Yeah. But it's, you know, when we play these game-like structures, always sort of in it is this sort of what are the extremes to which you can push the game, you know, and those sort of, or the edges of the game we talk about, and that I think that can exist in lots of different ways, you know. I think sometimes it's about, you know, what might be the worst story you could tell, or the funniest story, those sorts of extremes. But also I think it's about, you know, how inclusive or not inclusive can you be, how much is for the audience, how much is for the people on stage, you know. And it's like you, by taking away stuff from the audience, like sort of excluding them, then to sort of be very inclusive again, really makes that something, you know. So it's just all the time sort of testing, I think, what this relationship is between the stage and the audience, you know. And that we kind of test things out on each other that then the audience are sort of watching and witnessing. So sometimes they're witnessing us be a bit mean to each other, you know, a bit brutal with each other.
Well, I want to thank you so much for giving this time
it's been
to
a pleasure.
talk with us, and also for coming and sharing your work. Thank you very much.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.